Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Robert, and I'm serving as the interim dean for the Trulaske College of Business. Today, on our Trulaske Business Insider series, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Great Resignation, which is a term that our panelists today actually coined, and they'll probably talk a little bit about that. As a lot of you know, there's been significant upheaval in the labor market in the last couple of years. For some people, this has represented an opportunity. It's represented a crisis for some employers, an inconvenience sometimes for consumers, and it has contributed to a lot of uncertainty in the world and certainly the business world. There are lots of theories about why this has happened, including dissatisfaction at work or general malaise from COVID. Early retirements and people seizing other opportunities, possibly related to the desire to work from home. We wonder when the pendulum is going to swing the other way, and do these events represent maybe a sea change in the labor market and the way that we do work? What will it look like when things settle down? I want to first introduce our moderator, Daryl Smith. Daryl Smith is an associate teaching professor in the management department. Some of the students on the talk today might have had Daryl as a professor of collective bargaining or diversity, equity, and inclusion or human resource management. And Daryl is also a recent Kemper Award winner, which we're very proud of him in the Trulaske College of Business. It's one of our top teaching awards in the college. So I'll kick it over to you, Daryl.
Dean Robert, thanks so much for that introduction. I will tell you that I am absolutely excited about this topic and our guest speaker. I think this is the third Trulaske Business Insider that I've had the honor of hosting, and again, absolutely looking forward to today. Our topic is the Great Resignation. And as you said, Dean Robert, we are fortunate to have Dr. Anthony Klotz with us today, and he is the person who coined that phrase. Just to piggyback on your comments, Dean Robert, I hope it's okay if I just take a minute, right? Just take a minute to acknowledge the difficulties that we've all experienced over the past 2.5 years, right? Health crisis, the resulting economic crisis, the drastic shifts in how we work, how we learn, how we play, the time and attention that's been required to take care of ourselves and our health, to take care of others. I'm certain that is not lost on any of us. For many of us, our personal and professional lives have been twisted and turned a few times over. It's been quite dramatic, and maybe even for some traumatic. And so just wanted to make that acknowledgement. And now if I could just shift my comments and the focus more to the workplace and the workforce. We know that a record number of Americans have voluntarily resigned from their jobs. This is happening each month in the past year or so. In November of 2021, November of last year, approximately 4.5 million workers quit their job. Let's think about that for a second. That is a huge number. So that tells us something is going on. There's a huge shift, and it clearly has significant implications. Many of you are familiar with the U.S. workforce and some of the numbers, but our workforce in the U.S. typically ranges between 155 million and 165 million, with some modest variation based on seasonality and modest economic upturns and downturns. So again, we know this. What might surprise you is that in December of last year, there were 11 million job vacancies in the US. That is a huge number. But guess what? March of this year, that number was up to 11.5 million job vacancies. Clearly, something is happening in the economy, but I believe that something is also happening socially as well. So over the last few weeks, I've had a chance to share this topic with a few of my colleagues, as well as with a few of my students. And in those conversations, some themes have emerged, and I'd like to share a few of those themes, and I will do so in the form of questions. And I'm confident that these questions and others will be answered today. How do we accurately measure the Great Resignation? What are the key trends and dimensions associated with the Great Resignation? Did the difficulties of the pandemic cause many of us to simply reflect and rethink our lives and our careers? Is this many workers just simply reprioritizing their lives? Are workers just not happy? And if so, what's driving this unhappiness? Is it due to the work itself, or is it due to something external to what we call work? Did many of these workers shift to the gig economy? Are they now gig workers? And does that mean that the numbers are somewhat distorted when we look at job vacancies? Here's a phrase or a word that I can tell you, it was not in my vocabulary a few months ago. That word or that phrase is the YOLO economy, YOLO, you only live once economy. What are the factors that are leading to this? Those that have that perspective, what's driving it, and how's this going to play out in the balance of this year and in the years to come? If there is a great resignation, then surely there will be a great rehire at some point. Are we in that period now? How far away is the great rehire, and how long will it last? Final question, what should employers do today? Should employers be redesigning jobs, redesigning workplaces, given the trends that we are seeing as a part of the Great Resignation? All right, so before we get to our guest speaker, I do have a few housekeeping topics, and I'm checking to see how many folks we have signed on. It looks like we have 122, 124. The number continues to go up. We're anticipating as many as 200 participants. And I want to thank our faculty, our staff, students, our alums, and other guests to today's webinar. There will be the opportunity to ask questions. Just use the Q&A button on Zoom. We will monitor those questions, and we will do our very best to get as many of those questions heard and answered during today's live session. And for the students who are participating, please be on the lookout for an announcement at the very end of today's session and a QR code to make sure that you are being tracked appropriately for the EDGE program. And so at this point, I would love to introduce Dr. Anthony Klotz. Here at the Trulaske College of Business, we call these webinars the Trulaske Business Insider. Dr. Klotz, to call you an insider would clearly be an understatement. You know this topic well. As we have said, you have coined the phrase, the Great Resignation. Dr. Klotz is the Anderson Clayton Professor of Business Administration and an Associate Professor of Management at the Mays School of Business at Texas A&M University. He is an organizational psychologist who, based on his research on employment resignations, predicted this pandemic-related labor shift that he is calling the Great Resignation. Since then, his theory, since May 2021, this theory has been supported by months of data in terms of what's happening in the workplace with the record number of resignations. Dr. Klotz, it's been a pleasure to talk to you over Zoom these past few weeks and over the phone, and we welcome you to today's Trulaske Business Insider.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Daryl. It's wonderful to be with you and to be with all the Tigers out there. I've been to that campus a few times in Columbia and loved it. So happy to be joining you virtually to talk about the Great Resignation today. So during my time, I'll share a bit of information about what led me to say the Great Resignation is coming, what trends was I observing, and then show some data on what the Great Resignation really is and is not to make sure we have an accurate view of what's going on here. And then briefly talk about what organizational leaders can do to respond to the Great Resignation, which many of you and many of them are already doing. And I'll give a few more thoughts on that as well. But to start, where did this come from, the Great Resignation? Well, my research area is employee resignations. So I study not only why do employees quit their jobs, but my little niche of expertise is what happens after all of you and us make the decision to quit. How do we decide how much notice to give? How do we navigate that notice period and so forth? I'm just really interested in employee offboarding and what goes on during those resignations. So I'm always paying attention to the overall number of resignations in the US economy, how much turnover is going on, because that speaks directly to the phenomenon that I study. And it was at the end of towards the end of 2020, that we started to get optimistic that vaccines were coming. And there was this thought, end of 2020, early 2021, that when the vaccines arrived, they would quickly, hopefully be effective, the economy would open back up, everybody would go back to work, and we would get back to this normal that we had in 2019 before the pandemic. And there were some trends I was observing that made me think, I don't think we're going to go back to normal really quickly. In fact, instead of everybody quickly re-entering the workforce or staying at their current jobs, that there would be a wave of resignations. And so importantly, what were those four trends that I was observing? And these are things that I sort of pieced together over the course of a few months. The first one was pretty straightforward. And that's what I refer to as a backlog of resignations. So you can imagine that during 2020, during the heart of the pandemic, in the most intense time of it, a lot of employees were being laid off. The economy was not good. We were in a recession. And so it was probably the worst time ever to quit your jobs. When there's uncertainty in the world, we tend not to resign. We tend not to take risks. And so I assumed that there were many people who, had 2020 been a normal year, they would have quit their jobs. But 2020 was anything but a normal year. And when I looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, I did see this sharp decrease in resignations during 2020, which led me to believe a lot of employees were just hanging out in their jobs, but would enact their plans to leave if the economy opened back up and we started to exit out of the pandemic. So the second element was closely linked to the pandemic as well, and that is burnout. And we know that burnout is a predictor of turnover, and we know that even before the pandemic, the hustle culture of 2019 and the stress of 2019, there was a lot of burnout in the economy. But what stood out to me as I talked to my MBA students, as I talked to organizational leaders, as I looked at reports about burnout in the US economy, is just how widespread it was. And so some of you can probably empathize with this, that it was not just frontline workers who were feeling burnt out and healthcare workers. It was also middle managers and CEOs. We've seen a record number of CEO resignations in the last year. It was also you parents who were trying to work full-time while educate your children full-time from home. And so I knew that, like, one of the only ways for people to get a break from burnout is to get away from that which burns you out. And so my second thought was burnout is very, very high, and a number of individuals are going to seek to take a break from work or to switch jobs in order to get away from that burnout. Daryl mentioned the YOLO economy, and that ties into the third trend that I was observing. And that's that it seemed like a number of individuals were primed to make big life pivots. And one thing that was unique about the pandemic versus other recessions is that there was a health threat, like a public health threat involved in the pandemic. And there's this interestingly named theory called terror management theory, and it's pretty well supported by evidence that when individuals come into contact with threats to their physical lives or the lives of their family members when they're around illness, it causes them to reflect on their lives and think big existential thoughts. Am I living the life that I want to live? And when we reflect on our lives, we think a lot about the time that we spend at work, because a lot of us spend a lot of time at our jobs. And is my work a source of happiness? Is my work a source of meaning? And so during the pandemic was this interesting period of time where millions of people were working remotely, locked down at home and had the time to reflect on their lives. And I was hearing, again, from my students and from individuals I was talking to, that people were making big plans to change their life once the pandemic was over. In some percentage of those cases, that would involve a job switch. And then finally, probably the thing that gets the most attention is remote work. And that, we had this overnight shift of millions of us working remotely. And let's not paint remote work as this wonderful sort of work arrangement. It has challenges. It's not for everybody. There are serious pros and cons to it. And it was a really hard adjustment for many of us to make to remote work. That being said, it's hard to argue against the fact that remote work gives people more freedom, more autonomy in how to structure their work lives than any other work arrangement. And one thing we know is that autonomy is a fundamental human need. And when you give people autonomy in how they structure their lives for up to a year, and then you try to take that autonomy back away from them, that freedom, it often doesn't go well. And so you started to sense that there were a number of people who had worked remotely who said, I never want to go back to in-person work. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of individuals who are really at home, lonely, wanting to go back to work and all the wonderful things that in-person work provides. But I knew that would cause churn in the marketplace. The fact that we had all gone through what I would call the culture shock of switching to remote work, or many of us had, and now many individuals are going to be asked to go back. So those four factors together, the remote work, burnout, backlogs, and life pivots led me to make this prediction that there would be a great resignation. A reporter happened to call me because of my research on resignations and asked to do an article on how to quit your job. And I mentioned this theory to her, and she was astute enough to put it in Business Week, and it took off from there. And the question is then what happened? At the time that I made the prediction in early 2021, there was no evidence of a great resignation. It was just a theory. And so I'm going to share my screen here and show you what has happened since then. And hopefully everyone can see that. So let me just lay this out for you real briefly. So this blue line is 2019 prior to the pandemic, leading into the pandemic. And this is the total number of resignations in the US economy. Importantly, in 2019, that was the highest year we'd ever had on record for quits in the US. We've only been tracking it since 2000, but this was a very high year for resignations. Now, this maroon line is the start of 2021. And you can see when I made the prediction was right around here. And then we hit this 4 million number in April. And since then, we've seen record numbers of resignations in many months since then. These numbers for March of this year just came out 2 days ago. And there were a lot of individuals who thought this number would come back down because of inflation and other sorts of things going on in the economy. And yet we just set another record level of resignations. And so this is what you see when we're talking about the Great Resignation. Now, I think the 4 million number is useful. It makes a lot of headlines, but it's better to put it in context with the actual rate of turnover in the US economy. And so you can see here what these in 2019, about 2.3% of the US workforce quit their jobs per month. So we're sitting here at like an average, I'd say, of 2.3. So if you were an average company, 2.3% of your employees voluntarily quit in any given month. Now look at where that line has jumped to, especially in the last 5 or 6 months. We're hovering around 2.9 and 3%. So it doesn't take much to extrapolate that out to a year and say, instead of seeing around 30% of our employees turnover in a given year, we're probably running closer to 36% right now, which for an organizational leader with 100, 1,000, 10, or 10,000 employees, that adds up in a hurry, this elevated rate. Now, again, it's important to keep this in context. The pandemic and the other stressors of the last few years that Daryl mentioned exacerbated some of the problems that we were already facing in the workplace in terms of employee well-being. So let's zoom out a little bit. And this is the thousands of Americans who quit their jobs since 2013. you can see that the line has been going up. And part of that is because the economy has been strong. And others would say part of that is because the world of work is becoming less sustainable in terms of employee well-being and so forth. And so it's climbing. You see the pandemic here, this backlog of resignations. And now we're taking off again at an even steeper curve than it looked like where we were before the pandemic. And of course, the resignation rate in the US reflects this as well. Now, I won't spend much time on this, but since I'm speaking to a University of Missouri audience, I know the audience members are from all over the world, but I always like to look at it on a state-by-state basis as well. So I'll do that briefly here. And Missouri is interesting. I'm not an expert on why Missouri numbers look like they are, but you can see the same general pattern of a spike in resignations relative to 2019, but it isn't as striking as it is on the national level. And I will say it looks like the Great Resignation over the last few months isn't showing up as much as at the national level. The quit rate, remember in the US, it was running at 2.3 before the pandemic, which looks sort of like where Missouri is at. But then Missouri's up around the 3.2, 3.3, even higher than national averages before coming back down below where the US is at right now. And then the slope of the line that I showed you over the last 10 years has not been as steep in Missouri, which all attribute to Missouri having a great economy and employers in Missouri being great places to work. So you can see the quits by month and the rate there. So go ahead and stop sharing. But I think it's important to show those data because there's been a lot of discussion about how big is the Great Resignation? Is it still great? Is it still ongoing? Well, it's still ongoing, strong as ever. And of course, part of that is due to there being a tight labor market and some organizations increasing wages and others are not, which are driving it. And so with the last little bit of time that I have left before we open up for questions, I'd like to talk about, so what can organizational leaders do about this right now? And there's a number of different things, but I would say at a very basic level, this is the time for one-on-one communication with employees. And so during the pandemic, it was a time where many of us went into firefighting mode, and for good reason. There were just new challenges being thrown at us each day. And I think it's tempting now to look for easy solutions to the turnover issues that we're seeing, or to rely on maybe pulse surveys, which are great, or employee engagement surveys. But I think what employees are looking for is their organizations to acknowledge that they've changed a little bit, or they've experienced some pretty intense things, as Daryl alluded to, over the last couple of years. And they want to talk about how that has affected them. And in these one-on-one conversations, I think it's important for organizational leaders to collect data, qualitative data, and say, what is our workforce experiencing right now? Because I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't think hybrid work is better than remote work is better than in-person work. I think it's up to organizations to develop these bespoke solutions that fit how their workplace is feeling. I also think it's a time that coming out of these conversations that organizations need to be more open to creating work arrangements that are unique to each employee. And that's easier said than done. That's a lot of work. But for a long time, organizational psychologists have studied idiosyncratic deals, or ideals, which means working with employees to craft work and craft schedules that works for them. And so instead of treating everybody the same, if we're going to go hybrid, everybody has to be hybrid, actually taking into account employees' idiosyncratic needs and saying, how do we craft a little bit different job or a little bit different work arrangement for each person to fit their life a little bit better? I believe we're also entering into a time where employees are more open to businesses experimenting than ever before. And so I'll just use the 4-day work week as an example. There are many of us, like most of us on this webinar, I would guess that if you were given the choice between working 5 8-hour days or working 4 10-hour days a week, would opt for the latter, would opt for 4 10-hour days. But in the real world, there's business constraints. We just can't switch our business to 4 days a week. And so that requires some experimentation, probably, to try out a 4-day work week with part of the business and then see how it works with some employees staying Monday to Thursday, others shifting Tuesday to Friday, perhaps, I'm not sure. But letting your employees know, we've heard you. We're going to experiment with a 4-day work week, and then we're going to share the results with you in terms of our customer satisfaction, in terms of our employee engagement, and so forth, and see if it makes sense for us as a business to move forward with this. And the final element that I would say is this is a time of increased turnover. And in that chart I showed you, showed that like over the last 10 years, turnover has become more common in organizations. And so it's something that we're increasingly dealing with. It used to be 10, 20, 30 years ago that when an employee quit, it was sort of like, don't let the door hit you on the way out, or it was a betrayal, or we'll never talk to that person again. That's a really dated way of approaching employees leaving. And so more and more organizations are investing resources in the offboarding process and saying, what can we learn from departing employees, and how do we set them up to boomerang back in the future, or to be a wonderful alum out there talking positively about our organization and the labor market, or to just stay positively connected to them. And so when it comes to employees quitting, more and more organizations are treating the employees very well on the way out, are conducting stay interviews with the remaining employees around that leaving employee to make sure that those employees are happy, to see if they have any insights into how to deepen engagement in that work unit, and so forth. And just to give you one sort of radical idea, some organizations are saying for their top performers, instead of us closing the book on your time here, we'll give you a 1-year leave of absence where we put all your benefits and your tenure on hold. And we're going to check in with you every month. And if you want to come back in the next year, you can do so and plug into your old job as though you never left. And so obviously not all organizations can do that, but hopefully that's an example that shows how the way that we used to treat employees quitting is out of step with the current labor market. And it's more about maybe not celebrating individuals leaving, because it can be painful a lot of the time and cause a lot of business disruption, but making sure they're treated with dignity and respect on the way out. And so overall, is this trend of increasing resignations going to continue? I would say it's up to you all. It's up to organizational leaders and how they respond. And some organizations are being very proactive in their investment in employees right now. And I'm not just talking about pay and benefits. I'm talking about time and trust as well, and trying to deepen their ties, because this is a moment where we can reinvent work a little bit. And that one silver lining of the pandemic may be that we made the world of work in 2019 better, and that the world of work in 2023 or 2024 is going to be better for having gone through this painful pandemic. And so I tend to be pretty optimistic and feel like the changes that organizational leaders are making now are going to flip the tide on these increasing resignations that we've seen. And we can get back to a period of time where, sure, there's going to be employees who are sort of short timers and looking for greener grass all the time. But many employees crave long-term relationships with organizations. And I think companies are making changes that will allow them to retain those employees long-term. And so I just threw a lot out there, and I'm excited for the questions and to discuss this further. And I think with that, I'll hand it back over to Daryl, perhaps, to take some questions if anybody has any.
Dr. Klotz, thank you very much. We do have some questions that are coming in, and as we filter through those, I would love to present the first question. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the different sectors that are impacted, right? Is it retail, trade? Is it transportation? Where are we seeing the greatest impact with the Great Resignation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from an industry perspective, it was even before the pandemic, there were a few industries that are high turnover industries. And I think many of us could predict what these are: retail, food service, the leisure industry, and so forth. And those were the ones who were also the frontline workers during the pandemic, going back to burnout. And so not only are those the highest turnover industries, those are where we've seen the highest jump, along with healthcare. And healthcare continues to be quite high. Now, the Great Resignation has affected all industries. We've seen a jump in all industries, but not to the same degree in those front level jobs. Sorry, not to the same degree in professional service jobs as we have seen in those frontline jobs. But, not being an economist, there has been, I just looked at those March numbers that came out 2 days ago, and construction turnover spiked in that month. And I don't know if we have anybody here who could explain why that is, but this isn't something that's happening to every industry at the same time. But for right now, it is those frontline industries and healthcare that are really driving a lot of this.
Excellent, thank you. And we do have a question from one of my students, Ellie Chu. Ellie would like to know, are we seeing generational differences within the Great Resignation? Are we seeing younger workers, millennials leaving jobs? Or are we seeing, those baby boomers who are still hanging on? Are they retiring? Are there any generational differences in the numbers?
Yeah, Ellie, that's a great question. So it's always hard to decipher generational differences because, we can't go back and see if the pandemic had happened 20 years ago, how would these different generations respond? That being said, we are seeing higher turnover rates in particular in younger workers, but we don't know whether that's generational or because younger workers disproportionately make up those industries that I just mentioned. At the same time, we're seeing higher turnover in mid-career workers. So this is probably a little bit more privileged form of turnover where individuals are looking for higher salaries, looking for better career development, looking for hybrid work that fits their families. What's interesting to me, even though this makes up a smaller percentage, is that we are seeing higher numbers of early retirement. And so that would speak to the boomers exiting the pandemic and maybe wanting to wrap things up a little bit quicker in terms of career and get to the retirement phase. And we are seeing increased levels of entrepreneurial activity. So going back once more to Daryl's YOLO economy, you have individuals saying, I want to start that new venture. And when you think about the world of online businesses, online influencing, online ways to make a living, there's more than ever. And so we are seeing it, like I said, a lot of this is being driven by the younger generations, which tends to be where higher turnover is anyway, earlier in your career. But I found it interesting that baby boomers and early retirements, as well as the entrepreneurial activity, are up as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. I also see a question from Jim Olar. And Jim's question is all about where the data is coming from. Are you pulling data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics? Are you working with trade associations, specific companies? Where's your data coming from?
Outstanding question, Jim. So the data that I showed you it's coming straight from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so there's this acronym JOLTS, the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey. I highly recommend that everyone subscribes to that JOLTS report. And this has created an interesting conversation. And first, I will say, so these aren't my data. These are public data. Obviously, I didn't expect to have a term that I said go viral, and the last year happened for me. And so often people will say, like, are these data that your team that they're pulling together these numbers? And I'm always like, oh, there's no team. It's just me. I was just a researcher and teacher before this all happened. So I rely on public sources of data, which are great. So like in the United States, we're one of the few countries where this survey is done by a governmental institution that gives us these really great data. And that's led to some questions about, is this Great Resignation spreading to the rest of the world, or is it just in the United States? And part of the reason we're struggling to answer that is because the United States has the best data around monthly quitting in the world. And the UK does it pretty well, and there's some evidence of this happening there. And so there's a lot of countries from Singapore to Australia to India to Europe and beyond that have been asking this question, like, is this happening here? Companies are reporting higher turnover, but they don't aggregate their data like we do in the United States. And so it's been challenging to say, is this a global phenomenon, or is it something linked to the United States? But I appreciate the data question.
Excellent, thank you. I also see a question from Lizzie Sarami. Hopefully I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. Her question also gets back to what the numbers look like in certain sectors. And specifically, Lizzie is asking about finance, accounting, banking, wealth management. In that space, is there anything unusual happening?
Yeah, so I will say in these financial, accounting, professional services, turnover is higher. So they're seeing this happen to them, but nowhere near a lot of the other industries. And I think that's for a few different reasons. Although those industries are very competitive, those are all industries that are able to switch to remote and hybrid work fairly easily. And so that is a big satisfier for a lot of employees. I don't know if you all saw, but like Airbnb announced late last week that they're going to allow all their employees to work from wherever they want forever, which is going to put a lot of pressure on these, professional industries, white collar industries, to follow suit. Now, I think there's room for everybody, for each organization to say, here's what we want to do. Like, we want to be in person, or we want to be hybrid, we want to be remote. The other thing is these companies in the industries that you mentioned, we're already doing a pretty great job in many cases of engaging employees and investing in employees. So I've mentioned, like, hey, maybe we want to treat the offboarding process a little bit differently. So it was actually the consulting firms that figured out a lot of the times when employees quit a consulting firm, they become the consulting firm's customer. They go work for one of the customers. And so the consulting firms were saying, I think it's probably a good idea for us to treat them like alumni, like to treat them really well, because they become our customers. And so some of these organizations often find themselves on the best places to work lists, and we're doing a pretty good job. And then again, because they were able to switch to remote. Now, obviously, there's a lot of jobs out there that can't switch to remote work. There's millions of in-person jobs. And there's an economist at Stanford, Nick Bloom, who does really great work. And his surveys have shown that switching to remote work is the equivalent of getting a 6 to 10% raise. So you have this interesting situation. That's how people value it, as a 6 to 10% raise. So you have this situation in which maybe, let's say, half the economy got a 6 to 10% raise. And you have these in-person workers sitting there saying, like, must be nice. Like, it must be nice to be able to be home with your family and like doing these sorts of things. And they felt like, relatively speaking, that they were deprived of a benefit that a lot of the rest of the economy got. And so I think that's partly why you see these increased turnover rates in some of the in-person industries relative to some of the professional industries that were able to switch to remote or to switch to hybrid over this last 2 years. And but there, so in short, there is higher turnover, but not nearly as much as we're seeing in other industries.
Excellent, thank you. I also see a question from Jonathan Dennis, and Jonathan's question is all about how to keep employees once they've announced that they plan to resign. You mentioned a few of those best practices. Are there other best practices in terms of incentivizing people to stay, whether it's more pay, better benefits, flexible work schedules, whatever that might be? Are there any other best practices to highlight?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And unfortunately, we don't have lots of research on counter offers. I think that, that's a really interesting area. But some surveys have shown that like counteroffers typically don't work. If you retain someone with a counteroffer, you often then lose them in the next 12 months anyway. And so there's this debate that I don't have the answer to of if an employee says they're quitting, how far should you go to try to retain them? And I think a lot of managers struggle with that question, and we don't have great evidence-based answers for that. Now it's important to keep in mind, like, your relationship with your organization is just an exchange-based relationship where you're putting in your effort, time, expertise, human capital, and so forth, and they're providing pay, benefits, meaningful work, satisfying work, a good boss, good coworker relationships, and so forth. And although we often focus on pay and benefits, and this is a time in this country where wages are going up, benefits are getting better. You see, like, the big retailers say, we're going to pay for employees' college, we're going to give better parental leave, and so forth. Pay and benefits are really not what drives employee satisfaction on a daily basis. What drives employee satisfaction on a daily basis is, do I like the work that I'm doing? Because I do that work every day. Do I like my boss? Because I see her every day and interact with her. And do I like my coworkers? Because I'm working with these folks every day. And so I think it's important to keep these two different elements in mind. We need to be in the right ballpark when it comes to pay and benefits, and promotions and so forth. But it's really about doing meaningful work and career development and working in a place where I actually feel like my boss respects me and my coworkers are enjoyable to be around. And so I think it's important for organizational leaders to always be on the lookout of signs that employees are disengaging or are moving towards burnout, and intervening as soon as possible. And so it's kind of like when you're at the airport or somewhere and you hear the term, like you hear overhead, if you see something, say something. I think that with organizational leaders as well. If you see somebody who's disengaged for a few days or who's maybe having a bad week, don't wait until the annual or quarterly performance appraisal to bring it up. Like, that's the time to say, hey, Jonathan, how's it going? I've noticed you haven't been your usual self the last week or month or past few days. And it may be that you can pick up on these pre-quitting behaviors rather than waiting until the counteroffer stage.
Excellent, thank you. And so, speaking of pay and remuneration, other forms of incentive for workers, Ron Webb has a question, and his question speaks to the minimum wage and pressures on the minimum wage. If we are seeing, where it is more of a seller's market, I'm selling my labor to you and I need you to pay me more. Are you seeing signs of that? Do you think there's more pressure to raise the minimum wage? Are we going to hear more in terms of the fight for 15? What are your thoughts, Dr. Klotz?
Yeah, so keep in mind, I'm a psychologist and not an economist, and this is a policy and maybe politics related question, which I'll probably skirt around a little bit. But I mean, in most cases, like the minimum wage, especially in the wake of the past few months, I mean, the minimum wage is just completely out of step with where most organizations are paying their employees. And so I'll play both sides and say, like, if you're a believer that part of government's job should be to help provide meaningful work for employees, dignified work that gives them a paycheck that they can live on, then the minimum wage probably needs to be raised. Others may say, look, organizations are responding to the market. We don't need the government to necessarily tell us, because the wages rate is going up. Now, I did see a number the other day that even though wages have gone up over the last 6 months substantially, that the real wage of American workers has still dropped by 3% over that period of time due to inflation. And it's not even worth looking at the inflation projections for the next year or so, because they're depressing. And so that means this pressure is going to continue. And so this has opened up this really interesting dialogue, and I guess interesting from a scholar and important for the people who are being paid and who are paying, around How much do we pay people right now? Do we make cost of living adjustments due to inflation? And then this interesting, and this is why Airbnb's announcement was noteworthy, is should we pay employees based on where they're located? So if I'm a company based in New York and my employees are allowed to work remotely, so they move to Columbia, Missouri, which is a lower cost of living, I'm guessing, than New York City. But, should they still get paid the same amount? And of course, employees say yes, because we're doing the same work. But companies from Google to JP Morgan have said we're going to, if you want to live and work anywhere, we're going to adjust your pay based on the cost of living there. And so there is this interesting discussion that you're tapping into about pay right now, and how much should minimum wage be raised? How much should companies take into account inflation and the cost of living where employees are? And there aren't easy answers for sure.
Excellent. Thank you. And so, Dr. Klotz, we know that companies invest heavily in terms of establishing a corporate culture that works for them. And employees learn about the culture even during the interview process, and certainly during new employee orientation, through training and development programs. It's reinforced through performance management, reinforced through employee communications. And so Olivia Blackmore's question is all about corporate culture, the shift to remote work. What is that doing to corporate culture? Does it have an effect or not? And then does that relate to the Great Resignation?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something that a lot of CEOs are struggling with. So I appreciate Olivia asking it. So this is right now, a lot of employees, so there's this disconnect, and we're getting so many reports that show that there's far more CEOs and leaders who want employees back in the office than employees who want to be back in the office. And this is a real problem to solve. And often, so you can give employees, but we know from lots and lots of research that you can give employees bad news. You can tell them that you need to give them a pay cut or whatever. But the way to do it is to give them a fair explanation for why that pay cut is happening. So if you tell employees we're cutting your pay 10%, they're going to be upset. If you tell them we're cutting your pay 10% and here's why, and we understand this is difficult and so forth, there's research that shows that the fallout is far less when you just make it give a fair explanation for why it is. And there's this tension right now where employers and leaders are saying, we need you to come back to the office. And employees are saying, well, that's not the best news. Why? And leaders are often saying, because culture exists here. And I think what employees are looking for is, what does that mean? Why can't culture exist in a remote work structure? And I don't think there's a lot of great answers for that right now. Now, I will say, we do know that from the organizational culture literature that culture does exist in the symbols and the physical structure around the workplace. And so you can see lots of sports teams or successful organizations that have symbols of their success that only mean something to the members of that organization. Nobody else understands what that tradition means. And so there is an element to being in person around, when you walk on Mizzou's campus, you see lots of symbols that are meaningful to the many individuals who are at that institution and have gone through it. And when you're working remotely, you don't have that day-to-day connection with those symbols and artifacts and so forth. But I think the challenge for organizational leaders right now is to say, what is our culture? And for some companies, it's pretty clear, Johnson & Johnson has had the credo forever that this is who we are and who we are accountable to in terms of families and doctors. And then you can really take that culture and say, what happens if we look at this through the lens of remote work? And I think some companies' cultures translate pretty quickly and pretty easily to remote work. But I think for cultures that are really based on close teamwork, let's say, or close collaboration, We're still getting data right now on how much is lost when we go remote in terms of collaboration and in terms of innovation in particular. And so I think for companies like Apple that are struggling right now with getting employees back to work, they're saying, look, part of our culture is innovation, and we haven't figured out how to do this innovation through remote work, and we're not even sure if it's possible. We think people need to be co-located. And so I think your question hits at what a lot of employees want to know right now is, what is it specifically about our culture that's tied to remote work? And a lot of leaders right now are saying, what is our culture, and can our culture exist and flourish in a remote environment? So great question.
And of course, in addition to culture, the relationships at work matter a great deal. I can't help but think about the Gallup Pulse survey, or Q12 survey, and all of the research says, I think it's question 10, I have a best friend at work. That item tends to overperform. When workers have a best friend at work, they are going to be productive, they're going to stay, they're going to tell others what a great place to work this is. But with remote work, do those friendships exist at the same level? And could that be a factor here as well?
Yeah, I love that question too on Q12. And so some good news and some bad news on that front. I think from the best friend standpoint, and you all could think about how, if you worked remotely during the pandemic, was this true for you or not? But through remote work, what some studies have shown is that for the people that we are really close to, we maintained the same level of communication, if not a little bit higher during the pandemic. We were Zooming with these individuals, we're texting with them all the time, whatever medium you want to talk about. What was lost is the weaker connections, right? So when we're in person, we sit in meetings, and maybe we arrive at the meeting first and we talk to somebody that we wouldn't have otherwise talked to, or we go to the lunchroom, or we walk across campus to the cafe, or whatever it may be. It's these weaker ties that often spur innovation and interesting thinking. When someone from finance sits down at a table with folks from sales and strike up a conversation, that's sometimes where some of the most innovative ideas come from. And so I think there is remote work, I think, has shown that we can still maintain these really strong, close relationships. But some of the magic of the weaker ties, of the serendipitous, interactions that we have in organizations are lost, because you don't accidentally bump into someone on Zoom, right? We're all there deliberately, and then we get off when it's done. So that is part of the challenge when it comes to relationships and work and remote.
Great. We'd love to squeeze in one more question. I think we have time for at least one more. And so the question from Chris Dobbs is all about healthy turnover. What is healthy turnover? Were we seeing healthy turnover across most industries prior to the Great Resignation? Obviously, there's a spike with the Great Resignation. What is healthy turnover in your opinion? And when will we get back to healthy turnover?
Yeah, great point, Chris. You noticed earlier when I said, give somebody like a year leave of absence, I said you give your high performers that. You're not sad as leaders, you're not sad to see everyone go, right? It depends. And there is healthy turnover, and there are folks who want to go back to school to get their MBA or whatever it may be, that you're just happy to see them fulfill what they want to do. That being said, turnover tends to be quite disruptive to the organization. Look, we're all replaceable, but because companies overlook the offboarding process, it often causes quite a bit of disruption, and it can also lead to turnover contagion. You can imagine, you're happy with your job, but your coworker leaves, and beyond just liking working with that person, you also have to take on her work for a while you find a replacement, which contributes to your burnout, and then you're thinking about leaving. And so most of the organizational leaders that I talked to in 2019, and again, remember the economy was really good in 2019, which also contributes to higher levels of turnover, felt that turnover was too high, felt that employee loyalty was not what it used to be. And so I think we were above levels of healthy turnover. And there's no blanket statement. So like telemarketing industry, the amount of healthy turnover is much higher than, say, the financial services businesses that we were talking about earlier. But I think when you look at that chart of increasing resignations rates over the last 10 years, there's this debate on what's going on here. Does nobody want to work anymore? Are people not as loyal as they once were? They're more transactional. If you talk to a lot of workers, they say companies started this. They lay us off whenever they're having a little bit of trouble, and they furlough us, and then they bring us back when it's convenient for them. And that's why I think this is a moment where we can, when I talk to my students and I just ask them, MBA students, like, how many of you would prefer to, if you could have the same career trajectory, how many of you would prefer to work for a bunch of different companies versus the same company for your career? And it's split about 50-50 how they answer. And so I think there's a lot of employees out there, a lot of workers out there who crave longer term relationships than they're currently getting with their organizations. And then you have some employees who do want to move around and then check out how green the grass is in different areas. So I'd say we were above healthy turnover in 2019. We're well above it now, but I'm hopeful that with a lot of the changes that organizations are making in investments in employees and vice versa, that we'll get back to those levels. We're 2 years into the pandemic now, and I'm very optimistic about 2 years from how the world of work will look in 2024.
Excellent. And so we have several questions that are still in queue that we are likely not going to be able to get to. In fact, I know we're not going to be able to get to. And so, Dr. Klotz, that was amazing. That exceeded expectations. We had high expectations, and you certainly exceeded those high expectations. I see that Dr. Robert is on camera, and so I don't know if that's a cue for me to pitch it back to you or not, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. Or would you like for me to close out today's session?
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. I don't really have any additional comments. I think these are kind of crazy times, and I think there's a lot of converging things that are going on, and we're all, I think, living in a work time that is going to be remarkable in terms of how it shapes the rest of the working world. And I think Anthony did a great job kind of summarizing a lot of the issues that are going into this. So I just wanted to say thanks, Anthony, who's an old friend of mine too, for participating in this today. I appreciate it. And I'll kick it back to you to close us out, Daryl.
Okay, thanks so much. So again, Dr. Klotz, thanks so much for your time and for your insights. Thank you to all of our attendees, our faculty, staff, students, alums, and all of our many friends here at the Trulaske College of Business. And for the students, please stick around for that QR code and for an important message regarding the EDGE program. And to everyone, I will say thanks for your participation in the Trulaske Business Insider throughout this academic year. And we certainly look forward to seeing you in the next academic year here at the Trulaske College of Business, where we are leading the way in business education. Thanks for your time today.